Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Duke, and welcome to another episode of The Takeaway. We are joined again by Alex Newman with some more lovely public government school news. The NAEP scores are out, Alex, and the nation's report card comes up really, really bad for American government schools. Tell Mom and Dad America the gory details of their kids' public school education.
Oh my goodness. I think you need to see this report to believe it. It is just mind-blowing. Some of the data that came out, less than 1/3 of American eighth graders are proficient in math. About 1/3 of American eighth graders are proficient in reading. 1/4 of American high school seniors are proficient in math. And yet something like 82-83% of them are getting high school diplomas, even though, according to the government's own numbers, they're not even proficient in math. And if you look at, the definition of proficiency, you'll find that we're not exactly talking about, Einstein, Newtonian genius here. So we have a major problem. Our government schools are squandering ever more money to create ever dumber students. And yet, if you ask these kids, they'll tell you all the latest details about gender theory and the LGBT history and movement and the global warming alarmism, right? How we're all going to die from CO2 emissions. And yet they can't read and they can't do math. I mean, it is unbelievable. And don't take my word for it. Go read these numbers for yourself from the U.S. Department of Education. It is mind-blowing.
And just for the moms and dads at home, these tests are not done by some right-wing think tank. These are the government's own researchers pointing out that the government's own schools are failing miserably. The average is about 35% proficiency in math, 37% proficiency in English. These kids can't read, they can't do right. So proficient doesn't mean, like you said, outstanding. It means they're not at grade level. So you've got eighth graders, and the test was these results were primarily eighth graders. You've got eighth graders, the vast majority of whom do not read, write, or do math at an eighth grade level. And it doesn't tell you how far behind they are either. We know at FreedomProject, because we test these kids too, we know that it's not just a matter of eighth graders doing seventh grade math and seventh grade reading. Many of those kids are reading at a fifth grade, fourth grade, even third grade level, doing math at a third and fourth grade level. So this is a huge glaring gap. I have a quick question for you, Alex. In this time of turmoil, when we see teachers abandoning their posts to rally for more money, more benefits, more perks, where we see teachers actually shutting down their schools, demanding more money from states. Arizona, I believe, became a state today who just gave their teachers an across-the-board 20% raise. I'm a teacher. I wouldn't mind more money. But how do you justify these kind of A, extortionary tactics, B, capitulation on the part of state legislatures for these kind of results in the classroom?
Yeah, it really is difficult to explain unless you look at this through the lens of, that Dr. Sam Blumenfeld and I did in our book, Crimes of the Educators, and that is they are the system is deliberately designed to dumb down these students. And, the unions will tell us, and, the unions have been controlled by Marxists and globalists going back decades, and that's a fact. You can read the book NEA, A Trojan Horse in American Education, to read more. But they have been, they've created this system that is designed to dumb down the population, and then every time people notice, they say, oh, well, it's because we don't have enough money. That is an absolute fraud. And I sympathize with the teachers. I'm a teacher. I don't earn a lot of money. I know teachers. They don't earn a lot of money. But, what's going on here is fraud. If any business person were selling you a product and saying, hey, your product's going to do, ABC, and then you were to purchase the product and the product were to do the opposite, you would expect a full refund. You might even take the person to court for fraud. And yet here we have these government institutions that promise, hey, give us lots of tax money and give us your children and we'll educate them. And we turn around and we find out not only are they not being educated, they're being dumbed down, they're being turned into illiterates, they're being brainwashed to believe in Marxism, socialism, globalism, humanism, and all the rest of it. Not only should we expect a full refund, we should expect the ringleaders to be arrested and prosecuted for fraud, because this is fraud. And we know for a fact that giving these maniacs more money to squander is not going to do any good. Look at Baltimore. For example, look at Detroit, look at Washington, D.C., some of the highest spending school districts in the country, and yet they have some of the poorest results. I mean, if you look at Washington, D.C., according to the government's own data, more than 2/3 of the adult population is functionally illiterate. These are victims of government education. They've got tons of money, right? They've got money coming out their ears. The kids are not getting educated. So this is a giant fraud. This is a fraud of epic proportions. It is, in my opinion, a criminal scheme that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, in my opinion, I don't understand why. If we're going to start levying taxes and raising property, real estate taxes to fund the schools, and the schools fail our kids with our own money, why can't we lower them? If we bump up property taxes 4 or 5% to do these new initiatives for the schools, our kids continue to fail, get worse every year. Why can't we lower those again? And you and I have talked about this many times before, Alex. Common Core. One of the unique features of modern day school failure is institutions and pedagogies and curricular reforms, standards like Common Core. The one thing they are designed to do, we now know, is not to educate our kids better. It's making it worse. These standardized tests don't mean anything. But one of the principal objectives of Common Core was to spread failure equally across the country. Now, it's not just poor performing kids. It's not just lowest level schools or inner city school kids that are failing. All our kids now have accomplished a much lower level of proficiency, and that's what they wanted. They couldn't raise the low performers, but they could sure hold down the high ones. We have evidence of that now. About 35% of 8th graders in this country only are proficient in math and reading. And then you turn around and you see the opposite side of that coin. In the inner cities too, you haven't improved them. Places like, you mentioned Detroit, which has got about 5 to 7% proficiency. Detroit's the worst on the list. Only 5 to 7% of Detroit 8th graders. In places like Milwaukee and Chicago and New York City, New York is at 28%. Places like Chicago and Milwaukee, 12%. So the bigger the city, the more Democrat-controlled the city, the lower the performances. And all we've done is destroyed achievement for those kids who can, and we have pulled them a lot closer to the bottom.
Yeah, it is a national disgrace, Duke, and we have smoking gun evidence here. Your kids can't read, your kids can't do math, you're paying ever more taxes for this farce. And, all that's really being accomplished here is that they're weaponizing our children. I just got back from Turkey. The old Ottoman Empire had a very interesting practice. They would run raids into Christian Europe and kidnap Christian children. They were called janissaries, so they would be brought up in the Ottoman traditions, and they were turned into an elite military corps. They were turned into Muslims and turned into elite soldiers, and then they would go back to their former homelands as soldiers of the Ottoman Empire. They would speak the language, they would know the culture, and they were incredibly effective. That is exactly what the government schools are doing here with our children. They're taking our money, they're taking our children, they're indoctrinating them to become anti-American, anti-morality, anti-God, anti-Christian, anti-liberty, anti-everything that their parents are trying to instill in them, and then they're using them. I mean, we see them out rioting in the streets, and Antifa this and anti-gun protest that. They are weaponizing our own children against us with our own tax money, and here we see they're not even teaching them the absolute basics. You ask any parent, liberal, Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter. Why do you send your kid to school? Well, they need an education. They need to learn to read and to write and to do math, right? That's what people think of. And we have proof now from the government that that's not happening. So, something needs to change here. And if I were a parent with kids in the government schools, I would yank them out faster than you could say union protest walkout.
That's a great point. I prefer the metaphor of the virus, right? Rather than sending kids to school to become educated and productive adults, we are now sending the kids to school to say, like you say, we're weaponizing them. We're turning them into a kind of virus that we release then into the general population, and they're low information voters. They're easily manipulated. They've adopted all of the progressive ideological perspectives of their professors. They aren't critical thinkers. They're highly entitled. That's the disease, the plague that's going to take down the American Republic. Alex Newman, please keep doing your great work. Mom and Dad America, check out Alex's latest article. It is even more staggering than we've been able to express to you. Alex, we'll see you next week on The Takeaway.